Greetings again to another in our series on polygyny in the Bible. The question that we are asking and trying to determine is whether the Bible condemns polygyny or whether it condones it, whether it says that it's all right. We've been looking at some of the narrative sections in the Old Testament, a part of the law of Moses. Some would consider them the book of Genesis and half of Exodus as the prologue to the first giving of the law of Moses. We're going to turn now to some of the events or some of the laws in the law of Moses itself. However, let me begin with one other point of narrative before we begin. I might call this the law of Moses the polygynist. In Numbers 12:1, it says that Aaron and Miriam spoke out against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. Well, since we know from earlier chapters in Exodus that he married a woman named Zipporah, who was a Midianite, we now wonder who was this Cushite woman that he took on. And his brother and sister spoke out against her at that time. And you remember the story. God didn't take kindly to their criticism of Moses in this regard because he struck Miriam with leprosy for having challenged his authority, including the authority that he had to marry that woman. Well, we've talked before about the fact that when good men are involved in polygyny, what we have to do is to rehabilitate them if we do not accept the teaching of polygyny or the practice of it. And so how do people respond to this account of the Cushite woman? Well, the first thing they do is to say that we don't know for sure that Zipporah hadn't died before he married this Cushite woman. The problem with that is that that's an interesting speculation, but it bears the burden of proof if you're going to assert that. And there isn't the slightest bit of evidence that Zipporah had passed away at that point. Once again, it's wishful thinking. A second approach they take, which is probably the more dominant among people who don't like polygyny, is to argue that they were really the same woman. Now, we just said one was from Cush and the other one was from Midian, and Cush is way down in Africa and Midian is up on the Arabic Peninsula. So they don't certainly seem to be that way. So what happens is the scholars go digging, and try to find some way that the word Cush is sometimes used maybe once or so in the history of the times to relate to an area that's roughly close to where Midian was and so forth. And I've sometimes called this the hermeneutics of desperation. You're willing to accept the most unlikely alternative just so that you can say polygyny is not permitted in the scriptures. Well, Cush might be once or so placed near Midian, but that isn't nearly what you need to be able to establish what was said here. But there's an additional problem. The problem is, why did Miriam and Aaron wait until they were way out in the wilderness, probably months after they left Egypt, before they criticized him for his marrying this Cushite woman? Now, what difference does that make? Well, the difference that it makes is that the account of Exodus tells us that he went down to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and that he took Zipporah and his kids with him. But then when it became evident that God was going to send these horrible plagues, Moses, being the kindly husband that he was, sent her and the children back to Midian to be with his father-in-law and her father. So what I'm saying is that Aaron and Miriam had met Zipporah without, I can't imagine that he brought her down, but he hid her from them. There's no indication of that. He goes down with her and the kids. He's talking to Aaron all the time. Miriam had to be there. And so now we look at it and we say, they never said anything for months and months before they criticized him for marrying this Midianite woman who happens to also be Cushite? I don't think so. I think it's highly unlikely that that was the case. The fact that they condemned her and immediately Miriam was judged keeps us from saying that, well, they went down and they criticized her down there, but then they got in trouble with God later on. So, the position which has the least problem with the question of burden of proof is the one that says that they were different women. What difference does that make? That Moses was a polygynist. Well, if you think about it for a second, when we consider the laws later on that those who are opposed to polygyny sometimes bring up and say these laws prohibited polygyny, that must have been quite a shock to Moses if he was one. Why didn't God keep him from falling into this error? Once again, if that's a terrible sinful thing and God is going to very soon give him laws which prohibit polygyny, why wouldn't God keep him from falling into that problem? All, once again, makes this whole thing a little bit hard to believe. The first law that we want to consider is the law in Exodus 21:10. Here's what that law says. If a man takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. On first reading of this law, it certainly seems to regulate polygyny and therefore accept it. But those who oppose polygyny have several answers, as we might expect. The first relates to the context, and it says, the context is, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. What about that? Well, Davidson says, translators have commonly assumed that this refers to another wife in verse 10, in addition to the slave girl that he took back in verse 8. But, Davidson says, since the actual Hebrew of verse 8 implies that he did not take the slave girl to be his wife, then he never had a first wife, and therefore it says that doesn't mean that another, later on, doesn't mean that he took another wife. So they try to show that if we take 10 in the context of 8, that we don't have to believe that he was involved in a second marriage. Now it does say in the text that this other woman that he took, that with regard to the first one, he shall not give her marital rights. And you wouldn't think of giving marital rights to somebody who wasn't your wife. So that means they have to find some way of denying that that third provision that a husband must give a woman is really marital rights. And it's interesting to read people like Walter Kaiser, whom I greatly respect. He was a professor of mine at Trinity, to find them trying to wiggle out of this. Even Kaiser himself in his book acknowledges that there is a root possible relationship to the Hebrew. He also acknowledges that in 1 Corinthians 7 it says that a man has an obligation to give his wife sexual rights, and so therefore he says that would fit that, I have to admit. But there have been other interpretations. Why do we have all this leeway of interpretation of what the word that's translated marital rights means? Well, the answer is because it is what is called a hapax legomena. It is a once-used word, and those words are very hard to determine what they mean. For myself and my own thinking, I would have to say that that passage I mentioned a little bit ago about Isaiah 4:1 tells me something. The women there say, if you will take us on as a wife, we will provide our food, our clothing, if you will take away our reproach, which obviously means sexual relations so that he can give them children. Now, if I know that slightly different terms are used, but it's the same three concepts: food, clothing, and marital rights. If those three are the things that are important to the women in Isaiah 4:1, I think that stands to reason that those are the threefold things that we could think of back in Exodus 21:10. Another point to make at this particular time is that this kind of an argument, which they try to float, fails to understand that there's another verse that they have totally ignored, and that is verse 9. Verse 9 says, Or, in effect, if he gets this girl and gives the girl to his son, he must treat this girl as a daughter. Now, a couple of things could be said about that. The first is, how did he get that son? Doesn't that mean that he had another wife already before he took that girl to be a wife and promised her that she would be a wife? Well, I suppose you could argue his first wife had died and tried the same thing that we noticed with Moses. But once again, it's the same thing. The burden of proof falls on them. There isn't any concern with the text that this should happen only after a wife dies, that you should take a servant girl and make her a concubine. So it's a weak argument. But it's even worse. If you think about the flow of those verses between Exodus 21, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, here's the thing that's going on. We have a man who contracts a woman, buys her from her father. That's verse 7. Now we know that she was contracted to be a concubine because that's the point of verse 8. It says that if he takes this woman, but he decides not to designate her. Now, pause for a second, and let me simply say this. In the ancient world, if you made a contract for a woman and you paid off the contract, which happened here, she would be considered his wife. The only thing that he had yet to do to fulfill the relationship of her being a concubine or wife was to consummate the relationship. So what we see in verse 8 is that he decided not to consummate the relationship. And you know, the text tells us why. He contracted with this man to take his daughter, and the text tells us that she comes in his house and he goes, whoosh, this girl is ugly. He doesn't want to marry her because she's not good looking. That's what it says. She's not pleasing in his eyes. You know, I don't think it means that the first thing she did was to burn his soup or do something bad. You know, that's not the issue. She came to be a wife, and if she's not pleasing in his eyes to be a wife, it implies that she's not very good looking. So I ask you this question. If you're going to say in verse 8 that he didn't take her to be a wife, and you're going to draw a narrative relationship between the first instance of not taking her to be a wife in verse 8, and then you're going to use that as a basis for saying since she wasn't a wife in verse 10, he can't add a wife to her, let's keep the narrative going before we get to 10. He decides not to take this woman because she's not pleasing in his eyes, so what does he do? He gives her to his son. Isn't that just what you do with your children? Jesus said, if your son asks you for bread, would you give him a stone? If he asks for a fish, would you give him a snake? Well, if you were going to give your son a wife, would you give him what you considered to be a dog? Now, if he gives the girl to the son, that's the next one, he is to treat her like a daughter because, in fact, she is his daughter-in-law. If that's the case, and she is his daughter-in-law, now how can we go to 10 and say that he has an obligation to give her, his former servant, food, clothing, and whatever it is, whether it's sex, whether it's ointments, whether it's housing of some sort? He would have no obligation to give that to her because, in fact, she is his son's wife now, and he must treat her like a daughter. So since she's the son's wife and he decides to take another, why do we fault him because he doesn't provide those three things for her? Well, the explanation of that is that the three things aren't the three things mentioned there. They're really the three things that he was supposed to do. If he doesn't take her as a wife in 8, he's supposed to allow her to be redeemed. If he doesn't give her to if he gives her to the son, he's supposed to treat her like a daughter. But if he doesn't treat her like a daughter, then that's the second thing. And the third thing is that if he doesn't provide her with these things, then what happens? She goes out free. So they're saying that the going out free and the three things don't relate to the three provisions that are immediately before it and are spoken of, but they refer to the three consequences that he is supposed to involve himself with in these three different case laws. I hope you can see from the way that I've put this that this is a very has been made much more complex than it needs to be by people who are striving at any cost to get out of what appears to be obvious. Here's what's going on in that text of case law. What it's saying is the man contracts the woman to be a concubine. Verse 8, for himself. And the text is concerned with protecting her from abuse. So if he decides to back out of the deal, he must allow her to be redeemed. He cannot treat her as if she were a pure slave that could be taken and sold to another nation. That's verse 8. Then we come to verse 9. If he contracted for her to be the wife of his son. Now that's not narratively following verse 8. They are independent conditions. We have the primary conditional. He contracts the woman as a concubine. We know that from verse 8. Verse 8, one circumstance. He contracts her for himself. Verse 9, no, he contracted her for his son. Again, she's protected. He must treat her like a daughter and not like a servant because she's his daughter-in-law. Now, what is verse 10? Verse 10, like verse 8, is independent of verse 9, is independent of verse 8. Now we have the situation of where he did fulfill his obligation to her. He took her. But later on, subsequently, he saw another young lady that he liked, and when he takes this other woman, the text says he shall not diminish the things that he is obligated to give a wife. Now that, my friends, is the best way of looking at that text. We could go into even greater detail, but to do so is not going to change the situation at all. Even if you take the three things that the man must do, that's silly because he can't do all three things at once. So the three things must refer to the three provisions that a husband must give a wife. Now, after having said that, there's another way that they can try to get out of that, this thing, and that is by saying that, well, you know, there are case laws and you have things mentioned in case laws, and just because they're mentioned in them doesn't mean that the law condones what's going on. They cite a number of instances. One of them is in the next chapter, chapter 22. And in that chapter it says if a thief steals something, then he's going to have to pay it back. That's the form of case law. If, then. So if this person steals something, he must pay it back in multiple kind. Well, they say, it doesn't say in the text there, in the apodosis, that this thief is wrong. It just mentions him as a thief. My friends, please, in understanding whether things talked about in case laws are acceptable or unacceptable, you have to use a modicum of reason. If this man is a thief and takes something, he has to pay it back in multiple kind. The remedy tells us that what he did was wrong. His taking these things is what made him a thief. So, yes, that case law does identify the thief as a thief, even if he's not identified that way in the if section of case law. That's technically called the protasis, and the then section is called the apodosis. We've got to take the apodosis into account as well as the protasis if we're going to make statements like this. Another example that they give is Deuteronomy 24:1 through 4. They cite that as important. It's, of course, a very famous passage related to the subject of divorce and remarriage. And they point out that here is a man who divorces his wife and she goes out. It doesn't say that he's wrong for divorcing her, but of course we know from the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus, a comment on this exact passage, that this man is hard of heart. But it says you'd never know that from the text itself. Well, you know, sometimes we understand things in case law to be wrong, not in the protasis, but in the apodosis, as we just mentioned. But there's another way of figuring out that something is wrong. And that is, in the case of Deuteronomy 24, by divorcing this woman, he's breaking his promise to her that he is going to provide food, clothing, and sex. In other words, if you had understood Exodus 21, 10, and 11, you would realize that though the law there forces him to allow this girl now to go free, without the repayment of the bride price, verse 11. The reason why Deuteronomy 24:1 is a wrong thing for him to do is because he's doing there what Exodus 21:10 told him not to do. So one of the reasons why they can't understand Deuteronomy 24 is because they've already misunderstood Exodus 21:10, the very verse that we're talking about. They give another example, and that's the example of the case law that prohibits a prostitute from bringing her take to the temple to pay God for it. And it says, well, the text never says that she as a prostitute is guilty of anything. It just says she can't bring her take. Once again, the apodosis should tell us that if she can't bring some of the money she made from the night before and give it to God, the reason is because of the way she earned it. But if that's not good enough for you, there is, in that case, yet another law found elsewhere in the book of in the book of Leviticus in chapter 18, which tells us that prostitution is wrong and it shouldn't happen to a daughter of Israel. So what we have here once again is a certain amount of misdirection, trying to say that we just don't know what is really right and what's wrong in some of these case laws. My friends, if you understand the case laws, you will not have that problem. But if you come at the case laws with the idea that this must agree with my presuppositions that polygyny is wrong because, oh, it can be traced all the way back to the Genesis Edenic ideal that was spelled out, then every time you find polygyny being mentioned, every time, you are going to interpret everything about it as negatively as you can toward the subject of polygyny.